St. Helena, the sainted mother of Emperor Constantine, used her considerable influence and wealth, borrowing from her son, to build churches in the Holy Land. 3 centuries after the events described in the Gospels, she went to Jerusalem and to Bethlehem to build churches where Jesus was buried and where Jesus was born. Now, I've been to both of those churches several times, but then I have also been to Jericho, where the guide showed me the actual sycamore tree that Zacchaeus climbed up into so that he could see over the taller people when Jesus came to town. Now, Helena was no archaeologist. She wasn't determined to preserve history. She was a devout worshiper. And so when she asked the people in Bethlehem, where Jesus had been born, the locals showed her a little shepherd's cave. So she, of course, did not then enshrine the cave. She had the entire hill excavated and replaced the hill with a giant cathedral, and in the lower floor, rendered in very nice Italian marble, was a new shepherd's cave. Visitors to the Church of the Nativity are often treated to a rather plaintive Israeli tour guide who says that the manger that Jesus was born in is not there, not because of the obvious reasons that a crude wooden manger would have fallen into dust thousands of years ago, but the tour guide will tell you that it's not there because it was stolen by the Catholic Church and that it is now housed in the Vatican collection. The absurdity of that claim never seems to trouble Israeli tour guides, nor has it troubled the Vatican curators of their museum collections, who consistently refuse to relinquish the old wooden manger, which has no more to do with Jesus than I personally have to do with the Russian caviar trade. Sometimes it's just hard to embarrass religious people. One of the most difficult issues in teaching Bible to my college classes is the fact that we moderns tend to be very, very fact literal. You read the parables of Jesus, and he says that the kingdom of God is like a man that had 2 sons. Or another parable says that the kingdom is like a woman who lost a coin. And students will get mad and say, well, which is it? You know, it can't be both. Is the kingdom like a man that had 2 sons, or is it like a woman that lost a coin? I sit in the back of our sanctuary sometimes and watch Dr. Trobish patiently teaching us about the Gospels and trying to understand them as stories and the great power of stories to reveal spiritual truths through the use of metaphor and paradox to open our minds to new realities. But inevitably, by the end of the class, someone will raise their hand and say, but how do we know all this really happened? And I was complimenting David for being much more patient than I am when it comes to answering questions like that. And in the midst of our conversation, someone walked up and demanded that Dr. Trobish explain to them how God could be so cruel as to kill all of the animals in the great flood of Noah, that the people had sinned, but the animals hadn't sinned. And so how could God kill every single animal except the few that were on the boat? And, I jumped in and said, don't you understand that the Noah story is not history? It's a sermon. It's a morality play, but it's not history. It never happened. And David interrupted me and said, well, actually, it not only happened, but it happens every time the story is told. For him, the telling of the story makes it real, not that you could actually go and find remains of a boat on top of Mount Ararat in Turkey. It is the telling of the story that conveys the message and makes it real in that moment when the community is gathered to hear the story. When St. Helena went to Bethlehem, she was looking for the stable mentioned in Luke's gospel. And she had to make a choice, because in Matthew, the only other gospel writer that tells the story of the birth of Jesus, in Matthew, Jesus is born in a house. In Luke, Jesus is born in a stable. The 2 gospel accounts of the birth of Jesus have virtually nothing in common with each other except for the gender and name of the child. In Matthew, the Holy Family lives in Bethlehem, but they have to flee to avoid the slaughter of the innocents, and they end up settling in Nazareth for their safety because a new Herod had taken charge of the Galilee. In Luke, the family lives in Nazareth, but are compelled in the most unlikely manner. I mean, you don't do a census by telling people to go to another town and register. But in Luke, he contrives it in a way to make them go from Nazareth, where Jesus was clearly born and grew up, to Bethlehem. They both had reasons to set the birth in Bethlehem, but neither account is historically true. We have every good reason to assume that Jesus was born in and grew up in Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth. Neither Mark nor John are interested at all in the geography or the circumstances of Jesus' birth, but Matthew and Luke, for very Jewish reasons, want to say that Jesus was born in Bethlehem to get him to be in the lineage of David. But Matthew and Luke don't compare notes with each other. The shepherds, the angels, the stable, the Magnificat, that's only in Luke. The Magi, the star, the flight to Egypt, that's only in Matthew. The one thing they have in common is that neither one of them is the slightest bit interested in the historical facts because they are busy trying to tell an important story. And we're still wondering why the Vatican refuses to give the manger back to the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem. The best way to kill a good story is to try to take it too literally. One of the great rallying cries of progressive Christianity is that we take the Bible seriously, but not literally. The question we should be asking is that if Matthew and Luke are not giving us the details of the historical event, then what are they giving us? What's their point? Why would they write a birth narrative that's not historical? And that is a good question. And that is the question you should always bring to a storyteller. What's the point? What's the moral of the story? What are you trying to tell us? Matthew is at pains, beginning to end, to tell the story of Jesus in a way that proves that he is the Jewish Messiah or King, anointed one. He begins his account with a long genealogy tracing Jesus through the family of Joseph back up to Abraham, and then he tells us that Joseph wasn't really the father of the child. It's like I said, Matthew doesn't really want to be disturbed with particular facts. Matthew is telling us a story, and we should show him the respect to be quiet and listen. Similar to Luke's version, Matthew's story is full of irony and paradox. Though Matthew will quote Old Testament texts repeatedly for the next 25 chapters after the birth narrative in chapter 2 to prove that Jesus was the Messiah, still he leaves all the Jews out of the narrative. No one in the temple was aware of the birth of Jesus. But there were some foreign astrologers who knew about it, and they traveled all the way across the wilderness to come and bring presents. Now, astrologers were anathema to the Jews. Practicing astrology was punishable by death, according to Deuteronomy 17. If you encounter anyone practicing astrology, you're supposed to take them outside the city gate and stone them to death. And yet Matthew, the most Jewish of New Testament writers, is still willing to slap traditional Judaism in the face and insist that it was these Gentile pagans, these astrologers, who knew about Jesus, but no good Jews did. There is a message of humility in this. As Michael Franti sings, God is too big for just one religion, that the Jews needed some humility in assuming that only they knew God. And Christians need to hear the echo of that, as do Muslims and Hindus. God is too big for just one religion. Matthew tells us a story of a Messiah who comes into the world, embraced by those who seek him, but endangered both by the institution of government and religion. The priests are indifferent, and Herod wants to kill him, so that Jesus is aided by members of another religion and then is forced to flee as a political refugee. If you let Matthew tell the story his way, you see how we Christians are always uneasy about institutional religion. And we're equally uncomfortable in the hallways of government power. We always look for Jesus, among the refugees, among the illegal immigrants, among those who are running for their lives. Now, Luke tells his Christmas story with entirely different details, but hauntingly similar themes. For Luke, Jesus is born into poverty and suffers both indignity and rejection by government and religion within this short narrative. They're forced from their home in Nazareth by an oppressive, occupying government, and then once they're in Bethlehem, a very Jewish community, they are not even shown the dignity to be allowed to give birth inside. And we've heard all our lives that there was no room in the inn for them, but I'm inclined to think that Luke is saying something even more ironic than the fact that there was a no vacancy sign flashing out in front of the Days Inn. Because, ancient hotels didn't rent rooms. They're not like a Days Inn. The inns of those days were just a big house, and most of them had one room with no internal walls on the lower floor, and then an upper room that was pretty insubstantial. You couldn't get very much weight in the upper room without falling through. So the inns just charged you to come inside, and then you had to find a place that was safe to lie on the floor. So in the ancient world, at what point does an innkeeper say, I really don't want your money? I mean, at what point do you think they do that? It is possible that Luke is suggesting to us that for religious reasons, it's not that there was no room inside, it's that there was no room for Jesus inside, like a lot of churches. Again, in Jewish tradition, everyone who happens to be inside a house when a woman gives birth is defiled by the issue of fluids. So they have to actually go and make an offering. So if you let a woman who's obviously in labor pains come into an inn, then a lot of your other paying customers are going to demand a refund, and they're going to go somewhere else. So the innkeeper is standing at the door saying, not you, not you. And for everyone that has ever been rejected by formal religion or by family or friends, you understand what it's like to be told at the door, not you, no room for you. Not that there's no room for the next person, it's just that there's no room for you. So where do we find Jesus in Luke's story? We find Jesus out in the barn. Again, we romanticize this with creches, but if you've spent much time in a barn, you know what is in a barn and what a barn smells like and what it's like to be in the barn. And to whom is the divine birth announcement given? Not at the temple, not at the palace, but to shepherds in the field. And we modern Americans have romanticized shepherds, but let me tell you, that's just not so, because being a shepherd was the real night cashier job at Walmart in those days. Sheep are smelly and they're stupid, and you have to watch them all the time. They get lost, they hurt themselves, they're easy prey for predators. Shepherds didn't get to observe the Sabbath. They were always unclean, literally and religiously. It was not the faithful Jews that took those jobs. It was the people that had already given up on religion, and religion had already given up on them, or they wouldn't have been shepherds. The angel appears to those people, the lowest of the low on the economic scale of Israel, and led those shepherds to a barn where Jesus is born. And that is a statement that we need to hear, that in our day we're more likely to find Jesus in a homeless shelter for runaway teens where some unwed teenage mother has just given birth to a baby than we are anywhere else. If you let Luke tell his story his way, you can appreciate why Jim Wallace says repeatedly that no one gets to go to heaven without 3 references from homeless people. The Jesus story is real. Every time you tell it, it's real. When we tell it, we bring good news to the poor, and we bring hope to those who are in despair. We shine a light into dark places. We promise justice to the oppressed, to the refugee, to the homeless, and to the unemployed. The story of Christmas is not the first cornerstone of organized religion. It's a story that begins our story of standing up to the government, of standing up to the church, of siding with the poor and the oppressed, of kicking at the darkness until it bleeds daylight. So Merry Christmas, my friends. Enjoy the story.
You've been watching a progressive Christian video from the Community Christian Church of Springfield, Missouri. We encourage our viewers to donate to our efforts in feeding the homeless and hungry of our community. Write to us at reverenddray@aol.com for more information.